The room went silent. Not because the CEO had entered. That was normal. People always froze when Richard Cole walked in. But this time, the silence was sharper, like the air had been cut in half. Everyone watched as the new cashier, a young woman in a faded cardigan with trembling hands, stepped forward and said the words no one else had dared to say to the man everyone feared. "Sir, you don't have to talk to people like they're nothing." For a heartbeat, even the sound of typing stopped. In that instant, it felt like the world had tilted, the man with all the power and the woman who had nothing, standing eye to eye in the middle of the office. Sophie Parker had only been at Cole Enterprises for 3 weeks. She worked in the lobby cafe, making coffees for stressed employees and hurried executives. To most people, she was invisible, just the girl who rang up your latte and wished you a good day. But Sophie's invisibility wasn't just in the office. Life had taught her to fade into the background. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, never having a family to fight for her. At 26, she rented a tiny room in the cheapest part of town, her paycheck barely covering bills. She'd learned that in a world where you had nothing, it was safer to keep your head down. Richard Cole, the CEO, was the opposite of invisible. Tall, broad-shouldered, always in an immaculate suit, he carried himself like a man who owned not just the company, but the air people breathed in his presence. His wealth was the stuff of local legend. But so was his cruelty. He shouted in meetings, belittled employees, and treated mistakes as personal insults. Sophie had witnessed it from afar, the slammed doors, the whispered "stay out of his way." But on that cold Tuesday morning, the storm came to the lobby. It started when the receptionist accidentally spilled tea on a document Richard had been carrying. His voice thundered across the marble floor. "Do you have any idea what this cost?" he barked, towering over her as she stammered apologies. People nearby pretended to be busy, eyes fixed on their screens. No one moved. No one ever moved. And then Sophie, the girl who avoided attention like a shadow, felt something tighten in her chest. She remembered being 13, standing in a kitchen as a foster father called her worthless because she dropped a glass. She remembered no one defending her. She remembered wishing someone, anyone, would step in. Her hands shook, but her feet moved forward before her brain could stop her. She looked up at the most feared man in the building and said softly but firmly, "Sir, you don't have to talk to people like they're nothing." The lobby froze. Richard turned slowly, eyes narrowing. The air between them was thick with disbelief. But instead of lashing out, he just stared at her, like no one had spoken to him like that in years. After that day, things shifted, not suddenly, but like ice beginning to melt. Richard didn't smile, didn't apologize, but he stopped barking orders in the lobby. He still barely acknowledged Sophie, yet she caught him looking at her sometimes, as if trying to figure her out. A week later, the first crack appeared. Sophie's old sneakers, worn thin at the soles, split apart on her way to work. She came in limping slightly, but still brewed coffee for every customer with the same quiet patience. That afternoon, she found a small box under the counter. Inside, a pair of new sneakers. No note, but the label read RC. Sophie didn't know what to think. Gratitude mixed with caution. She didn't tell anyone. The next time Richard came for his usual espresso, she thanked him, not for the shoes, but for something else entirely. "You were kinder to the receptionist yesterday," she said gently. "I noticed." Richard's jaw tightened, but for the first time, he looked unsettled, like he wasn't sure whether to defend himself or absorb the words. Over the following months, Richard began lingering in the cafe longer. Sophie learned pieces of his story: a brutal childhood, a father who measured love and achievements, and a business empire built out of fear, because fear had been the only language he understood. No one had ever offered him kindness without wanting something in return. Until Sophie. The turning point came in December, when Sophie's rent went up and she quietly started taking night shifts elsewhere. One evening, Richard noticed the dark circles under her eyes. He didn't ask, just told her to sit while he made her a coffee. It was awkward, almost comical, the feared CO awkwardly steaming milk. But when he handed her the cup, his voice was low. "You stood up to me when you had nothing to gain. No one's ever done that. You reminded me what I never gave anyone here: respect." By the end of that year, the office noticed something remarkable. Richard wasn't feared anymore. He listened more. He praised good work. He even hosted a staff dinner, and at the center table, Sophie sat beside him, laughing at something he'd said. Sophie's kindness had cracked a wall no one else dared to touch. And Richard's change came full circle months later, when the company created a scholarship fund for foster youth, in Sophie Parker's name. Moral of the story: kindness is powerful enough to change even the hardest hearts, and sometimes, the smallest voice can spark the greatest transformation.